The full recipe, as listed in the description, calls for one 12-ounce package of noodles and makes a 13 by 9 pan. I'm going to make an 8 by 8 pan, which will take 8 ounces of noodles, because I know that I'm going to eat the whole thing. Because I'm using 8 instead of 12 ounces of noodles, and 8 is 2/3 of 12, I'm going to reduce all the rest of the ingredients by the same amount. You can make any size pan you'd like. Simply measure the amount of dry noodles by filling the pan 3/4 of the way and weigh the amount of noodles it takes. Then adjust the rest of the recipe accordingly. I also prefer the extra wide noodles. Start with plenty of boiling water. If you cover the pot, it will boil faster. Add salt to the boiling water so the noodles don't taste too bland, and dump the dry noodles in. Give them a stir when you first start them, and again once or twice along the way so they don't stick together. Boil them rapidly for 7 minutes, which will be just a little over half done. Normally, noodles cook about 11 minutes. We don't want to cook the noodles all the way, or they'll be mushy in the pudding. We want to let them finish cooking in the pudding and absorb all the flavors from the pudding. You can tell when the noodles are done by taking one out and cutting it. You should see a light line down the center of the noodle where it still hasn't cooked yet. As soon as the noodles are done, take them off the heat and dump them into a strainer. Then immediately bathe them in cold water so they stop cooking and all the starch is rinsed away so they don't make the custard like paste. Make sure they're not sticking together and leave them in the strainer to drain completely while you make the custard. You can also store them in the refrigerator after they're drained and make the custard a few days later. Start the custard by melting butter. I'm going to put it into the microwave for about 30 seconds. And once the butter is melted, pour it directly into the mixing bowl. Next, add the cream cheese. It should be room temperature so that it blends into the custard easily. But since this cream cheese is still cold, I'm going to cut it in small pieces so that it warms up to room temperature quickly when added to the mixer. Then add the sour cream. An easy way to do that with no measuring spoons or cups to clean later is to place the sour cream container on the scale. Zero the scale and remove the amount of sour cream needed for the recipe, putting it directly into the mixer bowl. Next, add the half and half or heavy cream. There's hardly a difference in flavor due to the milk fat in the butter. Just don't use milk, it's too watery. Now for the eggs. As I always say, break eggs on a flat surface, not on the edge of a bowl, so no shell fragments get accidentally pushed into the interior of the egg. Break each egg into a small glass dish and examine it for impurities, blood spots, or shell fragments before dumping it into the mix. Then we'll add the sugar, again right off the scale and into the mixer so there's no measuring cups to clean later. Add salt next, and then pure vanilla extract. Whip it all together on a slow speed until it's smooth and there's no lumps. While the custard is mixing, we can begin chopping the fruits. So chop the apricots, golden raisins, and cherries. It's important to only use dried fruits because anything that contains liquid will dilute the creaminess of the custard. Chop the fruit very small so everybody gets a tiny bit in every bite. There shouldn't be too much fruit because it's not a fruit pudding and that will cover the noodles flavor. The fruits are only there as a special accent. Because this is a New Year's Kugel, traditionally bits of tart fruit was used, symbolizing the sweetness of the new year, overcoming the occasional tart moments. And fresh apple traditionally was added, symbolizing the season's ending harvest and a new beginning. Peel and core whatever apple you like, but it should be a tart apple. Apples will turn brown once they're cut and exposed to air, so as soon as they are cut, put them into the mixer where they will be covered with the custard, preventing them from browning. You can prevent apples from browning by dunking them in some lemon juice, but we don't want to introduce any lemon flavor into the custard. The apples are the one thing that must be done just prior to cooking and can't be prepared in advance. Cut the apples into pieces about twice the size of the raisins. Tiny pieces of apple will just turn into applesauce when cooked, and we want them to retain their shape and moisture. Mix the apples into the custard for a few moments so they're coated and they won't turn brown from exposure to the air. Then remove the bowl from the mixer and add the cottage cheese. Gently mix in the cottage cheese. We don't want to mix it too much. We want to keep the curds from blending into the custard. Lastly, you can add the noodles. Gently stir them in really well, making sure all the noodles are coated and the fruit is evenly distributed throughout the dish. Pour the mixture into a baking dish. The noodles should be 2 to 2.5 inches deep. Any less than 1.5 inches and it will overcook and be dry. Any more than 3 inches and it may burn on the edges by the time the center cooks. 2.5 inches gives you a beautiful tall standing pudding on the plate. It's best to use a glass dish because it will cook slower and the sides won't burn. Plus, you can see when the sides start to brown, which tells you that it's done baking. That said, I've baked hundreds of these in individual foil loaf pans using a pizza oven and they've come out perfectly. Use the spatula to make sure that the fruit is evenly distributed throughout the noodles in the baking pan. Before putting it into the oven, push the noodles down so they're covered with the custard. Any noodles that stick up above the custard will dry out and become hard in the oven. Now you can cover the dish with foil or a lid. Place it on a pan so if anything runs over, it doesn't drip into the oven and make a mess, and then put it into the oven for an hour. While it's in the oven, make the topping. I'm using crushed cornflakes for the topping. Regular uncrushed cornflakes might be even better because they look just like the noodles after baking. You could use breadcrumbs, but a subtle toasted corn flavor adds an indescribable deliciousness to the chew. You'll notice there's very little cinnamon. We only want a hint of cinnamon when you bite into the topping. Finally, adding a little white sugar which will melt during baking and bind everything together into a thin, crispy topping. After the pudding is baked for an hour, take it out of the oven and uncover it. It should be completely cooked inside. Or you can put it back into the oven for a few more minutes. Mix the topping well together with a spoon and sprinkle it lightly over the top, covering all the noodles but not piling on too much. Then put it back into the oven, uncovered, for 15 more minutes, or until the topping just starts to brown. When it's done, let it cool to room temperature, cut it into squares and serve. The squares can be wrapped in plastic and put in the refrigerator or frozen. Frozen pieces can be defrosted in the refrigerator and, like any pudding, is delicious cold. Or it can be reheated in a microwave or in an oven in a few minutes.